On a Long Island driveway in October of 2018, the odometer on a red 1966 Volvo P1800 read 3,260,257 miles. Irv Gordon put every one of them on that car himself, and Guinness certified the number. Volvo built a campaign around it, and for decades the story got repeated as proof that oil changes alone can make an engine immortal. But the engine turning under that hood in 2018 was not the engine the car left the Gothenburg factory with. So what does 500,000 miles actually take? Long Island, New York, in the summer of 1966. A high school science teacher named Irv Gordon walked into a dealership called Volvoville and paid $4,150 for a red P1800 coupe. That was close to a full year of his salary. He'd owned two Chevrolet Corvairs before it, and both had disappointed him badly enough that he went looking for something built differently. He bought the car on a Friday. By Monday morning, he was standing at the dealership service counter again because he'd already driven 1,500 miles over the long holiday weekend. That pace never really slowed down. Gordon's daily commute ran about 125 miles, and on weekends he drove for pleasure, long trips across state lines with the windows down. By 1987, the odometer had rolled past 1 million. In 2002, he crossed 2 million, and Volvo threw him a party in Times Square while he sat in the car surrounded by police officers in a no-parking zone. In September of 2013, on a stretch of road outside the village of Girdwood, Alaska, the P1800 turned over 3 million miles. But there was more going on in that driveway than the interviews ever captured. Gordon told interviewers the secret was simple. Change the oil and the filter every 3,000 to 3,500 miles, use the parts the factory specified, and follow the service book. He estimated he'd done 667 oil changes by the 2 million mark. He did the work himself in his own driveway, and he never had a garage. That car sat outside in Long Island salt air for 4 decades. It's a lovely story. It's also incomplete, because Gordon rebuilt that engine at around 690,000 miles. He rebuilt it again later, and in 2009, somewhere past 2.5 million miles, the original engine was losing compression badly enough that it came out of the car entirely and a different one went in. None of that diminishes what he did. It changes what the record measures. Gordon proved that a chassis, a body, a driveline, and a maintenance habit can survive 3 million miles. He never proved that one set of pistons and bearings could. There was a second detail sitting in plain sight on Gordon's commute that hardly anyone repeated. 125 miles a day, 5 days a week is a highway duty cycle. That engine spent the overwhelming majority of its working life at full operating temperature, cruising at steady load, with the oil hot enough to boil water and fuel back out of the crankcase. That is the gentlest environment you can ask an internal combustion engine to work in. Which raises the question this whole thing turns on. If clean oil is only part of the answer, what's the rest of it? Engine wear inside a cylinder block isn't one process. It's several of them, running on completely different clocks. And the one everybody has heard about happens at startup in a cold driveway. When an engine sits overnight in a cold driveway, oil drains down off the camshaft lobes, off the cylinder walls, out of the bearing clearances. The crankshaft settles onto its bearing shells. Nothing is floating anymore. When the starter motor turns that crank, those surfaces slide against each other with nothing between them but a thin residual film and whatever chemistry the additive package left plated on the metal. But how long does that condition last before the oil pressure catches up? Engineers call the interval boundary lubrication. It lasts a fraction of a second on a warm engine in July and considerably longer on a cold engine in February, because cold oil is thick and an oil pump can only move thick oil so fast. You'll see a number attached to this constantly, which is that 75% of all engine wear happens at startup. Sometimes the claim in the advertisement goes to 90. That figure circulates through oil company advertising, forum threads, and product listings for pre-oiler pumps, and it has been circulating since at least the 1990s. It's worth being honest about that number. It traces back to oil company marketing rather than to any single published study a person can pull up and read. And the tribologists who argue about lubrication for a living tend to treat it as a useful exaggeration rather than a measurement. What isn't in dispute is the direction. Startup wear is real, it's disproportionate, and it scales with how many times you turn the key, not with how far you drive afterward. Which brings us to the part of this that is measurable and slightly uncomfortable. The Federal Highway Administration runs a survey called the National Household Travel Survey. In the 2022 edition, the average American vehicle trip came out to 13 miles, up from 11 miles in 2017. But the distribution matters far more than the average does. A majority of vehicle trips in the United States are under 6 miles. Fewer than 7% of them run longer than 30 miles. And 6 miles, it turns out, isn't nearly enough. A cold engine on a January morning needs several minutes of running before the coolant reaches thermostat temperature, and the oil in the pan lags well behind the coolant. Until that oil crosses roughly 200 degrees, water condenses inside the crankcase instead of evaporating out of it. Combustion produces water as a byproduct, and a cold engine collects it in the pan instead of driving it off. But what does that water do once it's sitting in the sump? Two things, and neither of them is good. It combines with combustion byproducts to form acids that attack bearing surfaces, and it feeds the emulsion that eventually turns into sludge in the valve covers and the oil pickup screen. Run a car on nothing but 4-mile errands through a Michigan winter, and the oil in that pan will look and behave very differently at 3,000 miles than the same oil would after 3,000 highway miles in July. Every owner's manual sitting in every glove box in America already knows this. Open one and you'll find 2 maintenance schedules printed side by side. One is labeled normal, the other is labeled severe. The severe schedule lists short trips under 5 miles, stop-and-go traffic, extreme heat, extreme cold, dusty roads, and towing. Industry estimates commonly put the share of American drivers who truly qualify as severe at around 80%. That number is an estimate rather than a census, and it comes from oil change chains and dealership service departments that sell maintenance, so weigh it accordingly. But look at the trip length data one more time and it becomes difficult to argue the direction is wrong. Oil doesn't wear out the way a brake pad wears out. It gets consumed chemically. A modern motor oil is roughly 80% base stock and 20% additive package. Detergents keep deposits suspended in the fluid. Dispersants keep soot particles from clumping together into abrasives. Anti-wear compounds like zinc dialkyl dithiaphosphate plate themselves onto loaded surfaces like camshaft lobes and sacrifice themselves in place of the metal. Antioxidants absorb heat damage. Every one of those additives exists in a finite quantity, and once it's spent, the oil in the pan is still slippery and no longer protective. That distinction is the whole ballgame. So which part of the engine notices first when that additive package runs dry? Usually it's the timing chain. The chain doesn't stretch the way the word suggests. The pins and rollers and side plates wear against each other under load. The pitch between links grows, and the assembly gets measurably longer. Camshaft timing drifts out of correlation with the crankshaft. The position sensors notice, the engine computer sets a fault code, and a rattle appears for 2 seconds on cold start. On a bad day, the chain jumps a tooth on the sprocket and the valves meet the pistons. Turbocharged direct injection engines are especially hard on chains because they put more soot into the oil. And soot is an abrasive. Ford acknowledged timing chain wear on certain EcoBoost engines in a technical service bulletin. General Motors, Nissan, and BMW have all had engine families with documented chain wear patterns that their own bulletins tied back to oil condition and oil specification. The lubricant industry did respond to this. On the 1st of May in 2020, a new oil standard became licensable in North America, API-SP, alongside its companion specification, ILSA CGF6. 7 years of development went into those two standards, negotiated between automakers, additive chemists, and oil marketers. 2 of the new engine tests are the ones worth knowing about. Sequence 9 measures whether an oil suppresses low-speed pre-ignition, the abnormal combustion event that has been cracking pistons and snapping connecting rods in small turbocharged engines. Sequence 10 measures timing chain wear, specifically under sooty conditions over 200 hours. However you read that, it amounts to a lubricant industry admitting in writing that modern engines had started eating their own timing components, which brings up the other thing modern engines do to their own oil. Direct injection sprays fuel straight into the combustion chamber at very high pressure, past the intake valve rather than through it. Some of that spray lands on the cylinder wall. Some of it scrapes down past the piston rings and into the crankcase. On a cold engine, less of it evaporates back out. In a turbocharged engine under boost, the mixture is often enriched, which makes the whole problem worse. The result turns up in oil analysis as fuel dilution. The oil in the sump gets thinner instead of thicker, and viscosity drops away from grade. Owners send a sample vial off to a laboratory, get a report back flagging fuel contamination in red, and reasonably conclude their engine is grinding itself into powder. But the laboratory data tells a stranger story than the report does. The data pushes back on that. Oil analyzers, one of the laboratories doing this work at scale, reviewed years of accumulated results and found that direct injection engines with traditionally high fuel dilution mostly weren't showing elevated wear metals in those same samples. Iron, aluminum, and chromium counts stayed inside normal ranges. The laboratory revised its own reporting language as a result. Fuel dilution still gets flagged on the report, but an oil change is no longer recommended on that basis alone, unless the wear metals climb or the viscosity falls off a cliff. That's a useful correction from the laboratory bench, and it cuts against a great deal of what gets said about direct injection online. It isn't a clean bill of health either. Viscosity is the variable that matters, and when fuel dilution drags a 0W20 oil far enough below grade, the film separating a bearing from its journal gets thinner than the person who designed it intended. And the oil is only half the fluid story. Coolant isn't just antifreeze with dye in it. It carries a corrosion inhibitor package protecting a cooling system built from aluminum cylinder heads, an iron or aluminum block, brass fittings, solder joints, plastic radiator tanks, and rubber hoses, all sitting in one shared fluid at one shared temperature. Those inhibitors are sacrificial by design, and they get consumed doing their job inside the block and the radiator. So what happens in a radiator when those inhibitors are finally gone? The coolant turns acidic. Healthy coolant sits somewhere around a pH of 8.5 to 10.5. Once it drops below 7, it starts attacking aluminum, pitting the cylinder head and the radiator core from the inside out. The system can also begin conducting stray electrical current through the fluid, a process that eats pinholes through heater cores. The water pump impeller cavitates and loses material off the blade edges until it can no longer move enough coolant to matter. Older green coolant, the inorganic kind, wanted replacement every 2 years or 30,000 miles. The organic acid formulas that replaced it in the mid-1990s claim 5 years and 150,000. Long life was never the same thing as permanent, and mixing two chemistries that were never meant to meet can neutralize both additive packages and drop sludge into the passages. However it gets described on the repair order, a head gasket failure at 200,000 miles is almost never a gasket that simply got tired. It's usually an aluminum head that spent a decade sitting in acidic coolant, or a cooling system that quietly lost its ability to move heat and let the head cook itself out of flat. If you're getting something out of this, subscribe. This channel goes deep on how American cars get built, maintained, and quietly retired every week. While all of this was happening under the hood, something else was going on out in the used car market. Because there's a fact about engine longevity that maintenance advice tends to walk right past, and the numbers behind it are not comfortable readings. So how many engines out there are ever getting anywhere close to 500,000 miles? In 2025, the automotive research firm IC Cars analyzed close to 400 million vehicles to work out which models were most likely to reach 250,000 miles. The average vehicle came in at 4.8%. That's roughly one car in 20. The best performer in the entire study, the Toyota Sequoia, came in at 39%, about 8 times the average, and Toyota took 10 of the top 25 positions in the rankings. Read those numbers carefully. 250,000 miles is half the target we're discussing here, and even the single most durable vehicle on American roads misses it 3 times out of 5. But the odds are only half the picture, and the other half was settled long before the car reached a showroom. Design matters enormously. Materials matter. Whether the engineers specified a chain guide that survives 15 years of heat cycling, and whether the oil pump was sized generously or sized down to hit a fuel economy target. Whether the head bolts clamp evenly across an aluminum deck, and whether the piston ring package was made thin enough to cut friction and thin enough to lose tension by year 12. No maintenance schedule on Earth rescues a design that was never going to get there. And there's a harder truth sitting underneath even that one. The engine is frequently not what ends the car. So if the engine survives all of that, what finally takes the car off the road? S&P Global Mobility put the average age of a light vehicle on American roads at 12.8 years in 2025, with 289 million vehicles in operation and a scrappage rate holding steady near 4.5%. Passenger cars now average 14.5 years, the oldest on record. Walk through a salvage yard outside Cleveland or Buffalo and look at what's sitting in those rows. Rocker panels rusted through to daylight, subframes eaten from underneath by road salt, cars with perfectly healthy engines parked next to a transmission quote that exceeds the entire value of the vehicle by $2,000. Rust, collision damage, and arithmetic retire far more engines than mechanical wear ever does. The engine in a 2008 Camry sitting in a Buffalo scrapyard is frequently the healthiest thing left on the car, still holding compression on all 4 cylinders while the body around it dissolves into orange dust. Longevity in practice is a property of the whole vehicle and the whole neighborhood it lives in, not a property of the block alone. A garage sedan in Phoenix and an identical sedan in Rochester are running the same engine on 2 completely different clocks. There's one more habit worth examining because it's the one people are proudest of. But is warming the engine up in the driveway helping it at all? Idling a modern engine in a cold driveway to warm it up is close to the worst thing you can do to it in the morning. During that warm-up phase, the engine runs a rich mixture, and excess fuel washes down the cylinder walls, stripping the oil film off the bore and diluting what's in the pan. Meanwhile, the engine is producing barely any load, which means it's producing barely any heat, which means the oil takes far longer to reach the temperature that boils water out of it. 30 seconds is enough to get oil pressure everywhere it needs to go. After that, gentle driving warms the engine faster and more completely than sitting still ever will. The carburetor era ritual outlived the carburetor by about 30 years. So what actually correlates with an engine reaching 500,000 miles? Duty cycle comes first because it carries the most leverage and drivers control it the least. An engine that runs long, hot, steady miles accumulates distance while doing very little damage to itself. An engine that runs 6-minute errands accumulates damage while barely accumulating any distance at all. 2 cars can show the identical number on the odometer and be in completely different mechanical condition, and the trip log explains most of that gap. Oil condition comes second, and that means interval far more than it means brand. An ordinary synthetic changed on the severe schedule with a specification matching what the engine was designed around will outlast an expensive oil run to the extended interval printed on the bottle. The specification on the container matters more than the marketing on it, but the third item is the one that quietly ends the most engines. Heat management, and it's the most neglected item on the whole list. Coolant replaced on a schedule. A thermostat that still opens when it should. A radiator that isn't packed with 15 autumns of leaves and cottonwood seed. Aluminum engines are unforgiving about a single serious overheating event in a way that old iron blocks were not. After that come the parts nobody thinks about until they fail. The oil filter with a working anti-drainback valve, which keeps oil sitting in the filter overnight so the pump isn't starting dry every morning. A PCV system that pulls water vapor and fuel vapor out of the crankcase and then gets clogged and ignored on 100,000 cars a year. The air filter, because whatever dust gets past, it ends up as abrasive slurry in the cylinder bore. Last comes the factor with no mechanism at all, which is early attention in a driveway. A cold start rattle lasting 2 seconds is a chain tensioner telling you something specific. A slow coolant loss with no puddle on the driveway is going somewhere, and that somewhere is usually a combustion chamber. The 500,000-mile engines almost all belong to people who investigated small noises instead of turning up the radio. Is any of that a guarantee? It isn't. Irv Gordon's original engine still needed a rebuild at 690,000 miles, and it belonged to a man who changed his oil more religiously than almost anyone alive. That red P1800 is still being driven today. Volvo owns it now, and the odometer has kept climbing past the number Gordon left on it, which means the figure on that driveway in 2018 was never really a finish line. What he actually left behind was a habit. Roughly 40,000 hours behind the wheel. 667 oil changes by the 2 million mark. A car that got looked after on a Tuesday afternoon when there was nothing whatsoever wrong with it. 500,000 miles isn't a technique you apply. It's what happens when a decent design meets a gentle duty cycle and an owner who keeps paying attention over a stretch of time long enough that most owners lose interest first. Next week, we're taking apart the opposite case, the engine families that failed early, what went wrong inside them, and what the manufacturers knew before the bulletins went out. If you want to know which side of those odds your own car is sitting on, that one will tell you. Which leaves the question that started all of this. If the man with the highest verified odometer reading in history still needed a second engine, how much of longevity is really up to the owner, and how much of it was decided on a drawing board years before the car was ever built?